So I'm Wenying Shou from UCL, and I want to give you a brief tutorial on ecology, a sub-question of ecology, which is community stability, right? Whether this community composition is stable. So let's start with the most basic, right? The most basic growth equation. So n population size, a single population size, and how fast it changes is proportional to how many mothers, right, in this population, and how fast they divide. And this gives rise to this the well-known exponential growth curve. But we know that organisms cannot grow exponentially. And so then the logistic equation is used, which, the first, let me see whether this works. Okay, so the first part is exactly the same as this, exponential growth. And the second part is sort of like competition, right? It's a negative, and it's n times n. So it's an intra-population competition. And the k is the carrying capacity. So the curve looks like this, right? So if n is very small, and this term can be neglected, so it's exactly like exponential growth here. And when n hits the carrying capacity, when n equals k, then this is 1, and then this dn over dt is 0, so population ceases to grow. So that's carrying capacity. So we want to look at equilibrium state, right? So the fixed points. So to do this, I just use n dot to represent dn over dt. So the n population size does not change anymore. We set this to 0, and we can see that there are two solutions, two roots, right? So either 0 or k. And we want to know the local stability of these fixed points. That is to say, if we were to make a small perturbation, delta n, how does this delta n change with time? So this is actually very easy to see for this example, right? So you plot n dot against n, and then we know that it has two roots, and it should look like this, right? 0 and k. So now let's imagine we make a small perturbation here. We add a small number of individuals, and then we look up. We can see the growth rate is positive. So then this small population will continue to grow, right? So the small perturbation will amplify over time, and we call this unstable, using this open circle to indicate that. Now let's go here. Hold on for a second. Let me just minimize my other model. Sorry. I need to minimize this. Okay, so now I can see. Okay, so now we go here, right? So if we add some individuals to this carrying capacity state, so then we look down, right? The growth rate now is negative. So if you add some more individuals, growth rate becomes negative, and the population size will shrink. So we'll go back to k. So this k is stable, and we use a solid dot to indicate it's a stable fixed point. So that is so essentially, let me summarize, right? So this basically you examine to understand whether a fixed point is stable or not. You examine the slope of n dot against n at the fixed point. And if you get a negative slope like this, that's stable. If you get positive slope, it's unstable. So it's very sort of like my didactic example of assaying stability of a fixed point. Okay, so now I'm going to the higher dimension. So let's again start with something simple like two species, right? So like let's look at x1. So x1 is the population density of species 1. So that is a sort of basal growth. The term here is a basal growth. And this describes how species 1 is affected by species 1, right? It's intra-population competition. It's like what we were saying before. If A11 is negative, it's sort of like self-inhibition. And how 1's affected by 2. So this is sort of like the effect of fitness per individual of species 2. And then we can write analogous equation for the second population. And in general, this can be expanded for a community of many species, right? So where the population size of xi changes due to the basal growth rate without interactions, plus all the influences from all other species on this focal species. And we call this generalized Lotka-Volterra model, because Lotka-Volterra initially used something like this to describe prey-predator interactions. But based on this interaction matrix, the elements of that, you can do positive interactions, negative interactions. So it's generalized. So now, so now going back to stability. So we want to look at the stability of, say, a two-dimensional, two-species communities, right? So then what you do is that, okay, suppose we have this fixed point, right, x star, y star, and we know that because they're fixed point, these have to be 0. So now we want to ask, right, if it's stable, then small perturbations to this, right? So if you delta x and delta y must shrink with time. That's to say, if you do derivative, right, of this, if you evaluate it as a fixed point, these should all be negative. So let's look graphically. It's x star, y star, the fixed point, and we make a small perturbation. So then this is x, y is a new point, and this delta x, delta y. So just a little bit of algebra. So we want to see, first of all, how does delta x change over time? So with delta x is simply x minus x star. And we know this is, dx star over dt is a fixed point, so it's 0, so it's equivalent. It's equal to this. And then we simply copy this down, right? And then we know xy is basically x star, y star perturbed by delta x and delta y. And then we can do Taylor expansion at the fixed point. So sort of like this, plus the partial derivative of f against x evaluated at the fixed point times delta x and the similar delta y. And we know this is 0, right? Because the fixed point, definition of fixed point. So then we can rewrite this. D delta x over dt equals this times delta x and this times delta y. And then we can do analogous equation here. And then we have this, this thing, which I'll return again and again. So basically, this delta x change, the rate of this the change is sort of like these 4 in this case, and we call this Jacobian, evaluated at the fixed point of interest, and times delta x, delta y. So then what do we do next, right? We just for simplicity, I just write them as A, B, C, D. For Jacobian, evaluated at the fixed point. And so we can, in fact, do linear transformations, right? So that we transform this to this. So these are the lambda 1 and lambda 2 are eigenvalues of this matrix, which is Jacobian evaluated at that fixed point of interest. And those are the eigenvectors associated with the eigenvalues. And it's actually not that important for this purpose, for this talk. So we can see this, right? So this we can transform, it's a linear transformation. We can transform to some different variable. We just call it uppercase, delta big X and delta big Y. And we then notice, right, we can copy this down, and we notice this is essentially this, except that there's d over dt. So this basically can just write that. So we just did some algebra trick, right? And now we have diagonalized the matrix. So now now it becomes really easy. So then we can look at how delta x change over time is simply lambda 1 times delta x, right? Because the 0 times delta y is 0. So then we know the solution to this, right? So it's delta x 0, your initial perturbation, and e times lambda 1 t. And so for this to shrink over time, lambda 1 can actually sometimes be complex numbers. So for this to shrink with time, the real part of each of the eigenvalues must be less than 0. And then the fixed point is stable. So that is like the two-dimensional expansion on a one-dimensional case, right? So that's how you analyze the stability of a fixed point in a two-dimensional case. So then introduce Robert May's work, right? So he applied this to complex systems, and he claimed that complex systems are not stable. So he starts with something like this. So this looks a bit different from the JLV, but regardless, you can view this A minus I as, you can think of this as Jacobian evaluated as a fixed point, right? So this is a little trick he did, right? And times X. And so basically he presumes that the steady state exists, right? And then, so basically this is A, the A has this elements distributed with mean 0 and the standard deviation of sigma. And then he uses a circular law, which says for a large random, like a large size random matrix, the eigenvalues are uniformly distributed on a disk in a complex plane, with the center at the mean of the diagonal elements. In this case, the mean of the diagonal elements, because this is mean 0, so it's minus 1, 0. And the radius being square root s times sigma. So for this to be stable, so this had to be all in the negative, right? The real part had to be negative. So the fixed point is almost certainly stable if, right, if one is bigger than the radius, which is the standard deviation of interaction strength times square root of S. So then you can imagine, then he claimed, right? So if the community is very big, you have big S, it's very unlikely for this to hold, and therefore the community will be unstable. So now that claim was kind of sensational in the sense that we know natural ecosystems are really complex, so why is that, right? But I want to actually mention one point, right? It's in the sense that if the network, right, is, there's, so if some species had gone extinct, so then the influence of these extinct species to other will be zero, and also influence from other species to the extinct species will be zero. So there could be many zeros there. And so this connectance would reduce the right-hand side, right? So connectance is percent non-zero entries. And so Robert made them consider this, like many species, some species will go extinct, so the C is less than 1. But regardless, I would say like the main insight turns out to be, correct. So then in the recent advancement, people thought, okay, so Robert May assumed the steady state exists. And what if, but we know many species, a fraction of species will go extinct. So how might we do a more rigorous calculation of this? And also this, right, without assuming the existence of the fixed point. So the general approach is called the cavity method. So what happens is that you have like this S community of S species and they interact with each other. They inevitably rely on weak interactions in the sense that the mean of the interaction strength is scaled with 1 over S, which is reasonable, right? If there are many species, then your average interaction strength with these species would be weaker. And this mathematically allowed those people to be able to put many terms to 0. And that's come up with analytical solutions. So that is actually mathematically convenient. And then the procedure is more or less like you add a cavity species, which is statistically indistinguishable from the resident species. And then you update the resident species boundaries by summing the direct influence from the intruder, the invader, and the indirect interactions, because the invader affects the other species, and the other species in turn affect you. And then from this, you can then calculate the equilibrium abundance distribution of the cavity species across different communities. Right, so you have distribution. And in some communities, the cavity species would go extinct, right? But then it's like sort of like the big trick is that because the cavity species is statistically indistinguishable from the resident species. So if you look at the distribution of the cavity species across communities, the abundance distribution is the same as the distribution of species within a community. So then you can get for any community, for generic communities, what would be the fraction of species that survive? And if they survive, what's the abundance distributions of that? Right, so now I'm just going to quickly give you one example from Guy Bunyan. So he had the species board, and he knew some of them would go extinct. And again, it's weak, you can see it's weak interactions, and then the interactions sometimes can be reciprocal, right? Because if I strongly inhibit you, the chances you will also strongly inhibit me. Like, how does this reciprocity affect stability? So he had this, you can see this phase diagram. So this is sort of like the mean and the standard deviation of the interaction strength. And you can see the mean, like it's sort of like kind of boring. But if you look up, right? So if you at the fix the mean interaction strength, you look up the heterogeneity, interaction heterogeneity, you transition from unique fixed point to multiple attractors, which could be stable fixed point, can be, chaotic attractor, can be, all sorts of things, and to the unrealistic unbounded growth. And furthermore, he showed, and the detail again is not important. The point is that the interaction reciprocity, the gamma, which is a correlation coefficient between the AIJ and AJI, also influences the curve, right? Where the curves are. And so that is sort of GLV. And we recently looked into, say, the difference between resource explicit and resource implicit models. So resource explicit models is like these two species will compete because they all want to have this resource. So when they consume the resource, they inhibit the resource, but the resource promotes their growth, right? So this is like sort of interaction diagram. And like JLV is more like a resource implicit model, because when you have a competition like this, it's sort of like you have intra population competition and inter population competition. And in fact, you know that if the resource dynamics is much faster than the species growth death dynamics, then you can do this approximation, right? So like, so sort of assume them to be at the pseudo steady state. So then this actually transforms to this, and we call this effective log of Volterra. And so then we look at, right, so in this, we can control the resource pool size, like the diversity of the resource pool. And then we on y-axis, we look at the probability of a community of being stable, right? So then, so from ELV, so if you ignore resource dynamics, you see that regardless of the resource pool size, it's more or less stable. But if you consider explicitly the resource dynamics, you see that at the small resource pool size, the probability of stability is really low, right? So it has a very strong dependence on diversity of the resource. So this is work done by my student Jamila and co-supervised by Akshat Goyal from ICTS. And then, so what about experimental tests, right? So there are very few of them. So I just want to highlight one example of this test. So going back to Robert Mays, right, like a general JLV, when we remembered he claimed that community will be unstable if it's many, many species, or if the interactions, the standard is heterogeneity is high or interaction strength is high. So Hu et al. From Jeff Gore's lab, so they first did the simulations, right? So it's again JLV with some dispersal. And this is simulation results, right? So I know it's busy, but just bear with me. So if you fix the interaction strength, you increase the species pole size from S equals 4 to 20 to 50. You can see initially it's stable, and then it becomes fluctuating. And then similarly, if you fix the species pole size and increase the interaction strength, you also see this transition. So they say, okay, we're going to experimentally test that. So the way they test it is the following, right? They take 48 bacterial isolates from the soil, right? So, and then they can control the number of species, right, to put in this community. And then they let this grow and dilute. So 30-fold daily dilution, and with 10 to the negative 6, like a migration from an original species pool. And after 10 days, they do 16S RNA sequencing to look at species composition as well as biomass. So I'm going to show you the results now. So this again very busy, but don't worry about it. Initially, they're showing this biomass, right? So the y-axis is biomass, total biomass of the community is measured by turbidity. And the x-axis is time. And you can immediately see sort of striking patterns of the orange they call fluctuating, and the purple they call stable, right? So they call stable. And so how did they create different? So these three patterns, high nutrient, they approximated it with high interaction strength, and the low nutrient is low interaction strength. And the way they measure interaction strength is to look at the presence of how does the presence of species 2 reduce the carrying capacity of species 1, right? Which is a bit different from how it affects the growth rate of species 1. But regardless, you can see that when you have high and high, right, you have more more probability of fluctuating, even though I don't find this quite as convincing as the other ones. But it's what's odd is this thing, right? The model didn't really tell you that total biomass should fluctuate. But regardless, they observed this fluctuation. And then they ask, well, what does the relative abundance look like, right? So then they zoomed into this one, right? So this one is S equals 12, the 12 species to start with. And they look at the 8, because 48, you have many, many different ways of choosing the 12. So they look at that 8 examples. And they say, well, the orange one, the 4 is fluctuating, and the 4 is stable, right? So they call this fluctuating and the stable. And I just find it a little bit disappointing for the stable ones, because stable ones seems to me many of them just have fixed for single species, right? And also there were problems with quantifying interaction strength, because at some of the values it's either greater than 1 or less than 1. So it's not, and there's no quantitative relationship, because May said it's a square root S, right? So it's a very strong prediction. Square root S times sigma, right? So with regard to the species pole size, it's much, much muted because of the square root relationship, but they don't have any. So what I want the take home message is that I feel like there's still a very, very big market for testing these theoretical predictions experimentally. So to wrap this up, I want to say that from my view, I feel the random matrix theory is useful for setting our null expectations about when interactions are like independent and identically distributed. And then, but the thing is that the question then becomes how might we begin to understand real communities where interactions are unlikely to be, identically distributed. And secondly, sort of like how might we, in general, how might we induce, regime shifts in community dynamics, right? So is there any way to have low, sort of like embed this in a lower dimension space and sort of like understanding it in a more sense of the general principles? So these are the two questions I want to leave us to discuss perhaps later in the day. And thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions. David and then Mike.
Does anyone ever use the same techniques to study like the behaviors of, like instead of a species, how much count they have, the count of a behavior that they're doing? They may have like 7 different behaviors they do, but you notice that when this one is doing this behavior, it makes this behavior happen less over here, and kind of the same techniques, but on the behavioral side. So
I believe, yeah, so you're talking about indirect interactions, perhaps, like sort of like how does, say, the presence of this hawk affect the ability of the rabbit to eat grass?
Yeah, or when the bear is hibernating, then, this one should have this behavior, that the behaviors might matter and not just the species.
Yeah, I completely agree. Because this is sort of like, because I think the motivation for these physicists, I mean, these are physicists who did this, right? So the motivation is that they want to ask what the generic features would emerge for very large communities, right? Because it's easy to think about the 2 species communities. It's easy to think about many species community, but in the middle, like I think in the middle, which I think is where the real communities are, like what you are saying, like the more intermediate kind of like complexity, and with these behavioral heterogeneities, I don't think we have done, the field has thought of.
For like inside a body also, you could have behaviors and still kind of count how much behavior, how many of my cells are doing, like, this operand, maybe some of the quorum sensing or something might satisfy the same kind of models or
yeah, because then you can say, right, you basically have one, like the state variable, maybe there are multiplicity of state variables. So you can say if the bear is hibernating, it's this. If the bear is not hibernating, it's that, right? I think right now people are doing this. So if you just consider trophic levels, right? Because I'm like the rabbits, I eat like many different, grasses, right? So but at the rabbits level, they're like the random, sort of like a sort of IID distributed interactions across them, and then the grass is like these kind of competition. But then between the two, there is sort of like it's actually, I think it's a beginning of like a much bigger kind of exploration. Yes.
Mike.
Yeah, probably people ask this question a lot. Is there evidence that real ecosystems are stable?
So there are, for example, healthy, so like, if you look at the communities, so like, because we know, so for example, like the gut microbiome can be stable if you don't change your diet, right? So in this sense, but if you travel somewhere, like it can be perturbed, antibiotics can perturb you, right? But I think but it's true, like, because if you look at the phytoplankton or like plankton dynamics in the ocean, it's highly like fluctuating. So this kind of theory is trying to explain what could cause this kind of different dynamic regimes, and more importantly, how do you shift it? Because if the disease ones is sort of like going crazy, right, and then you want to have like some probiotics that reinstall the stability, how might you do this kind of to go from one state to another, right? So
we'll have one final question, Phil.
So I have a question about stability, because when you fix the parameter that you have, like the sigma and S, you still have the choice of being able to have like monostable, multi-stable. It's not like fixed, like in the phase diagram, because the parameter, although you have the sigma and S fixed, there are still variations of the parameters. So in variations, you could have monostability, multi-stability, or chaos. But that, I mean, in the phase it corresponds to only one point, and then then I'm confused because
No, it is. So like if it's here, yes, you could have many distributions, right? Like even with this
many
invariance.
possibilities of different stabilities, like monostability.
You mean multi attractors?
No, what I mean is at any point you can say, okay, like have bistability, but in the meantime, in that region, you could have monostability too, because the sigma is a very broad parameter. You can change the parameters within the sigma.
Yeah, but the thing is that if you have the sigma, right? If you have the sigma fixed, the mean fixed, you can have many different interaction matrix.
Yes.
But they will give you this because we have done simulations. We know that is. Of course, we didn't exhaustively do this, but we.
So let's discuss this over coffee when
No,
people
yes.
coffee break.
Coffee break.
Wenying, thanks a lot again.